I never believed in mercy, until the night Samuel Cartwright came knocking at my door. The wind was howling something fierce across the Texas plains, rattling the shutters of my small ranch house like the devil himself was trying to get in. My wife Martha had just put our 2 children to bed, little Emma and young Thomas, their innocent faces peaceful in the lamplight. I was cleaning my Winchester by the fireplace, the same rifle that had seen me through 3 years of brutal cattle rustling and claim jumping in these unforgiving lands. The knock came sharp and desperate, 3 quick raps that cut through the storm like gunshots. Martha looked up from her mending, her blue eyes wide with that particular brand of fear that comes to women on isolated ranches when strangers call after dark. I'd made a name for myself as the sheriff who never showed quarter to outlaws, never let a single one ride away to terrorize another family. The folks in Red Creek knew me as a hard man, fair but unforgiving, the kind who believed justice came swift and final at the end of a rope. My reputation had spread far enough that most wanted men gave our county a wide berth, knowing full well that crossing paths with Sheriff Jake Morrison meant facing a man who'd rather shoot than negotiate. But tonight felt different, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning crackling outside. I set down the rifle and moved toward the door, my boots echoing hollow on the wooden floor. Through the frosted glass, I could make out the silhouette of a man hunched against the storm, his hat pulled low and his coat whipping in the wind. Martha stood behind me, her hand instinctively reaching for the children's room, ready to shield them from whatever darkness had found its way to our doorstep. The knock came again, more urgent this time, accompanied by a voice I didn't recognize calling out over the howling gale. My hand found the grip of my Colt .45, a habit born from too many years of facing down men who'd rather kill than surrender. "Please," the voice called out, barely audible above the storm. "I need help." There was something broken in those words, something that spoke of desperation rather than threat. But I'd learned long ago that outlaws were masters of deception. I'd seen too many good men fooled by a wounded act, only to end up face down in the dirt with a bullet in their back. My finger found the trigger as I slowly turned the heavy wooden latch, every instinct screaming at me to be ready for trouble. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing a pair of dark eyes set in a face I recognized from wanted posters plastered all over town. Samuel Cartwright stood on my porch, the most wanted man in 3 states, blood seeping through his shirt and mixing with the rain that plastered his dark hair to his skull. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 25, with the kind of lean, desperate look that comes from months of running and hiding. His gun hand hung limp at his side, and I could see the fever burning in his eyes, the telltale signs of a man fighting infection and exhaustion. Behind him, his horse stood trembling in the yard, its flanks heaving with exhaustion, foam around its mouth from being ridden too hard for too long. This was the man who'd robbed 6 banks, killed 2 lawmen, and terrorized every settlement from here to the Colorado border. "Sheriff Morrison," he gasped, swaying on his feet like a tree about to fall. "I know what you must think of me." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The territory's most notorious outlaw, seeking sanctuary from the very man who'd spent the better part of a year hunting him down. Blood dripped steadily from his wounded side, pooling on the weathered boards of my porch, each drop a testament to how far he'd pushed himself to reach this place. Martha moved closer behind me, and I could feel her presence like a warm anchor in the chaos of the moment. The reward on Cartwright's head would set our family up for life, would pay for Emma's schooling and Thomas's future, would buy us the bigger spread we'd been dreaming about. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected to find in the face of a killer. Fear, yes, and pain, but also something else. A flicker of humanity that reminded me uncomfortably of my own younger brother, dead these 10 years from a fever I couldn't afford to treat properly. Cartwright's lips were turning blue from the cold and blood loss, his entire body shaking with more than just the chill of the storm. He wasn't armed as far as I could tell, his famous twin Colts nowhere to be seen, probably lost in whatever scrape had left him bleeding and desperate on my doorstep. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to put a bullet in him right here and now, claim the bounty and sleep easy, knowing one less killer walked the earth. "My children," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "They took my children." The words hit me like a physical blow, because whatever else Samuel Cartwright might be, whatever crimes he'd committed, he was also a father. I'd heard rumors that he had a family hidden somewhere, that his desperate crimes were funded by something more than simple greed, but I'd dismissed them as the kind of lies outlaws told to gain sympathy. Now looking at the raw anguish in his face, I realized those rumors might have been true. Martha gasped softly behind me, her maternal instincts responding to his pain, regardless of who he was or what he'd done. The storm continued to rage around us, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what choice I would make. They said if I don't bring them $50,000 by dawn, they'll kill Emma and Jacob. His children bore the same names as mine and my brother, a coincidence that felt like the hand of fate reaching down to complicate what should have been a simple decision. Cartwright's knees buckled, and he caught himself against the doorframe, leaving a bloody handprint on the white-painted wood. I could see now that he was unarmed, that he'd come here not to fight but to beg. This proud outlaw reduced to pleading with his greatest enemy for help he had no right to expect. Behind me, I heard Martha's sharp intake of breath as she processed what he was saying. The implication that somewhere out there, two innocent children were paying for their father's crimes. The wind gusted hard, driving rain into the house and causing the lamp flames to flicker dangerously. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it now. Close the door on Samuel Cartwright and let justice take its course, or open it wider and invite the devil himself into my home. Everything I believed about right and wrong, everything I'd built my reputation on, hung in the balance of this single moment. Martha's hand touched my shoulder, a gentle pressure that somehow conveyed both support for whatever decision I made and a reminder of the precious lives sleeping just down the hall. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains like the sound of approaching cavalry, and I realized that whatever choice I made tonight would define not just Samuel Cartwright's fate, but the very man I believed myself to be. I stepped back and opened the door wider, my decision made before my mind could fully process the implications. Samuel Cartwright stumbled inside, his boots tracking mud and blood across Martha's carefully scrubbed floors, but she didn't say a word of complaint. Instead, she hurried to the kitchen, returning with clean towels and the bottle of whiskey I kept for medicinal purposes, her movements quick and efficient, despite the tremor in her hands. The outlaw collapsed into my reading chair by the fire, his face pale as moonlight, chest rising and falling in shallow, painful gasps. I kept my Colt drawn but lowered, watching him carefully for any sign that this might be an elaborate ruse. "Start talking," I commanded, settling into the chair across from him while Martha began cleaning his wound with gentle but firm hands. Cartwright winced as the alcohol bit into the torn flesh of his side, but his eyes never left mine, as if he understood that his life depended on convincing me of his sincerity. 3 days ago, he began, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion, I was riding back to my cabin up in the hills, bringing supplies to my wife Sarah and the children. His words painted a picture I hadn't expected, not of a heartless killer, but of a man trying to provide for his family in the only way he knew how. The wound was deep but clean, a rifle shot that had passed through without hitting anything vital, though infection was already setting in around the edges. Sarah had been sick for months, he continued, his voice breaking slightly as Martha worked to bandage his side. Consumption, the doc said. Nothing to be done for it except wait and keep her comfortable. I'd seen consumption take its toll before, watched my own mother waste away from the same disease when I was barely older than my Thomas. It was a slow, cruel death that left families desperate and broke, spending everything they had on medicines that rarely worked and treatments that offered false hope. Cartwright's hands shook as he spoke, and I realized it wasn't just from blood loss. The man was reliving his worst nightmare. The medicines, the doctors, keeping food on the table, it all cost more than an honest man could ever earn. Martha finished with the bandage and stepped back, her face reflecting the same internal struggle I was feeling. Here was a man who'd broken every law in the book, terrorized innocent people, and left widows and orphans in his wake. Yet his motivation was something any father could understand. And when I got back to the cabin, Cartwright continued, his voice barely above a whisper, the place was torn apart. Sarah was gone, and there was blood on the floor. His fists clenched as he spoke, and I saw the rage beneath his desperation, the fury of a man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the walls, like specters of all the choices that had led us to this moment. There was a note, he said, reaching into his shirt pocket with trembling fingers. The paper was stained with blood and rain, but the message was clear enough. His family had been taken by a gang led by a man called Black Pete Torrance, a name that made my blood run cold. I knew Torrance by reputation. He was everything Cartwright was accused of being, and worse, a man who killed for pleasure and took particular joy in hurting women and children. The note demanded $50,000, more money than most men saw in a lifetime, to be delivered to an abandoned mine 20 miles north of town before dawn. If Cartwright failed to comply, his family would die slowly, and their bodies would never be found. "Black Pete," I muttered, recognizing the crude handwriting and deliberate misspellings that were Torrance's trademark. Martha's face went white at the mention of the name. Everyone in the territory knew the stories of families that had crossed paths with Black Pete's gang and simply vanished without a trace. Cartwright nodded grimly, seeing the recognition in my eyes, understanding that I now grasped the true scope of what he was facing. "He's got Sarah and the children holed up somewhere in the Badlands," Cartwright said, his voice heavy with despair. "I've been riding for 3 days straight, hit every bank between here and the Colorado line, trying to scrape together the money." The desperation in his voice was real. This wasn't the calculated calm of a professional outlaw, but the frantic actions of a father running out of time. I stood and began pacing, my mind racing through possibilities and implications while the storm continued to rage outside. Cartwright watched me with the intensity of a drowning man watching a rope being thrown his way, knowing that his family's fate rested entirely in the hands of a man who had every reason to hate him. Martha moved to check on the children, making sure they were still sleeping peacefully, unaware that their home had become the meeting ground between justice and mercy. "Even if what you're saying is true," I said finally, "even if Black Pete has your family, why come to me? You know I've sworn to bring you in, dead or alive." The question hung in the air between us like smoke from the fire, heavy with the weight of all our shared history. "Because you're the only lawman in 3 states who can't be bought," Cartwright replied without hesitation. His words carried an unexpected respect, an acknowledgement of the reputation I'd built through years of refusing bribes and standing firm against corruption. "Black Pete's got half the sheriffs from here to Denver in his pocket, and the other half are too scared to cross him." It was a sobering admission, one that spoke to the depth of corruption that plagued our frontier justice system. I'd always prided myself on being incorruptible, but I'd never considered how that reputation might make me valuable to the very criminals I hunted. The irony was bitter. My integrity was exactly what made Samuel Cartwright believe he could trust me with his family's lives. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Black Pete didn't just take my family for the money. He took them to draw me out, to prove a point." The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the fire, as if his words had summoned something dark and cold into our home. Cartwright's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a knowledge that chilled me to the bone. "He knows about your family too, Sheriff. He knows about Martha, about Emma and Thomas." The threat was implicit but clear. Black Pete Torrance wasn't just holding Cartwright's family hostage. He was making a statement about what happened to anyone who stood against him, lawman or outlaw. Martha returned from checking on the children, her face pale but determined, and I realized she'd heard enough of our conversation to understand the stakes. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, which meant dawn was approaching faster than any of us wanted to acknowledge. I looked at my wife, then at the broken outlaw bleeding in my chair, then toward the hallway where my children slept in innocent safety that might be more fragile than I'd ever imagined. The choice before me was no longer simple. It wasn't just about justice versus mercy, law versus compassion. It was about whether I could live with myself if I chose the letter of the law over the lives of innocents, both Cartwright's and potentially my own. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, marking the beginning of what might be the most important 6 hours of all our lives. "I'll help you," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I'd fully decided to speak them. Martha's hand found mine, squeezing gently in support of a decision that went against everything I'd stood for as a lawman, yet felt more right than anything I'd ever done. Cartwright's eyes filled with tears of relief, his shoulders sagging as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from them, though we all knew the real burden was just beginning. I moved to my gun cabinet and began pulling out weapons, my spare Winchester, boxes of ammunition, and the sawed-off shotgun I kept for close quarters work. The familiar weight of the weapons in my hands felt different now, no longer tools of justice, but instruments of desperate hope. "We'll need more than guns," I said, my mind already working through the tactical challenges ahead. Black Pete's gang was rumored to number at least a dozen men, all of them killers who'd choose death over capture, holed up in terrain they knew better than any lawman. Martha disappeared into our bedroom and returned with an old cavalry saber that had belonged to my father, its blade still sharp despite the years. "This was your grandfather's," she said softly to the sleeping house. though I knew she was really speaking to our children, a promise that their father would return to them. Cartwright struggled to his feet, testing his strength and finding it wanting, but determination burned in his eyes brighter than fever. As we prepared to leave, Martha pulled me aside, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight like still water. "Jake," she whispered, "what if this is a trap? What if he's leading you into an ambush?" Her concerns were valid. I'd be a fool not to consider that this could all be an elaborate setup, a way for Cartwright to eliminate the one lawman who'd never stopped hunting him. But as I looked back at the outlaw, now struggling to reload his recovered pistols with hands that shook from blood loss and exhaustion, I saw something that convinced me of his sincerity. A man planning betrayal wouldn't look so broken, wouldn't carry such obvious pain in every movement and gesture. "If I don't come back," I told Martha, pressing my father's watch into her hands, "take the children to your sister in Denver. Start over. Forget this place ever existed." She nodded, though we both knew she'd sooner die than abandon the life we'd built together on this harsh frontier. The children stirred in their sleep as I kissed them goodbye, little Emma murmuring something about angels, while Thomas clutched his wooden horse tighter to his chest. These might be the last moments I'd ever spend in peace with my family, and I tried to memorize every detail. The smell of Martha's hair, the sound of the children breathing, the warmth of our home against the cold night. We rode out into the dying storm. Two men who should have been enemies united by circumstances neither of us could have imagined. Cartwright sat his horse poorly, swaying with each step, but he refused my offer to delay until he was stronger. Time was a luxury his family didn't have. The rain had turned to a fine mist that clung to everything like cold fingers, making visibility poor and the trail treacherous. Behind us, the lights of my ranch house grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Ahead lay 20 miles of broken country, perfect ambush terrain where a dozen men could hide and pick off anyone foolish enough to approach. "There's something you should know," Cartwright said as we rode, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Sarah died 2 days ago. The consumption finally took her." The words hit me like a physical blow, reframing everything I thought I understood about his situation. He wasn't just a desperate father trying to save his family. He was a man who'd already lost his wife and was facing the possibility of losing his children too. The magnitude of his grief was something I couldn't fully comprehend, the kind of loss that could break a man's mind or turn him into something inhuman. Yet here he was, still fighting, still hoping, still believing that mercy might exist in a world that had shown him precious little of it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. A man doesn't easily admit to that kind of vulnerability, especially not to someone he expects to be his executioner. Cartwright's silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with all the words he couldn't bring himself to say about loss and love, and the terrible things grief could make a man do. I thought about Martha, about what I might become if I lost her, and realized that perhaps the line between lawman and outlaw wasn't as clear as I'd always believed. We were all just men trying to protect what mattered most to us, and sometimes the world forced us to choose between our principles and our hearts. The abandoned mine came into view just as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. It was a desolate place, scarred by years of digging and blasting, with broken equipment scattered around like the bones of some great beast. Smoke rose from several points around the mine, indicating campfires and sentries, while the main shaft entrance yawned like a mouth leading straight to hell. Cartwright pulled up beside me, his face grim as we surveyed the challenge ahead. "They'll be expecting me to come alone," he said, walking in with my hands up and the money in a bag. But we both knew that Black Pete Torrance had never intended to honor any deal. This was an execution site, chosen for its isolation and the convenience of having a ready-made grave. "Change of plans," I said, pulling out my spyglass to get a better look at the enemy positions. I counted at least 8 men visible around the perimeter, which meant there were probably more inside the mine itself, along with the hostages. The tactical situation was nearly impossible. We were outnumbered at least 6 to 1, attacking a fortified position held by desperate men with nothing to lose. But I'd learned something important during my years as a lawman. Sometimes the impossible was just another word for a plan nobody had thought of yet. Cartwright watched me study the terrain, hope and desperation warring in his expression as he waited for me to find a miracle in the morning light. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Badlands in shades of red and gold, I began to see the outline of a strategy that was either brilliant or suicidal, probably both. The mine had multiple entrances, old shafts that had been abandoned when the easy ore ran out, and if my memory of the geological surveys was correct, some of them connected to the main tunnel system. It would be dangerous crawling through unstable passages that could collapse at any moment, but it might give us the element of surprise we desperately needed. "Samuel," I said, using his first name for the first time, "I hope you're not afraid of tight spaces, because we're about to find out just how much you really love those children." The abandoned mine shaft was a journey through hell itself, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, and choked with dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. Cartwright crawled behind me, his breathing labored and his wound reopened by the exertion, but he never complained, never asked to rest, driven forward by a father's desperate love. We moved in complete darkness, feeling our way along the rough stone walls, every sound amplified in the confined space until our own heartbeats sounded like thunder. Behind us, the entrance grew smaller and smaller until it was just a pinprick of light, while ahead lay only blackness and uncertainty. I could hear voices echoing through the main tunnel system, Black Pete's men laughing and joking as if kidnapping and murder were just another day's work. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we emerged into a wider chamber where weak shafts of sunlight filtered down through cracks in the ceiling. The sounds were clearer now, children crying somewhere deeper in the mine, and a man's voice raised in anger, cursing about the delay and threatening terrible consequences if Cartwright didn't show himself soon. My heart clenched at the sound of those young voices, so much like my own children's, innocent souls caught in their father's war against a world that had taken everything he loved. Cartwright's face was a mask of barely controlled rage, his hands gripping his pistol so tightly his knuckles had gone white, but I could see the calculation in his eyes as well, the outlaw's instinct for violence, tempered by a father's need to be smart about saving his children. We split up at the chamber's 3 exits, Cartwright taking the passage that led toward the children's voices, while I moved toward what sounded like the main group of bandits. The plan was simple in its desperation: create enough chaos and confusion that they couldn't use the children as shields, then trust that 2 determined men could overcome superior numbers through sheer fury and surprise. My boots found the floor carefully, testing each step for loose stones that might betray my presence. The skills learned from years of tracking outlaws now turned to a purpose I'd never imagined. Through a gap in the rock ahead, I could see firelight dancing on the walls and hear Black Pete's distinctive voice laying out his plans for torturing Cartwright before killing him. The sight that met my eyes when I reached the main chamber filled me with a cold rage that burned hotter than any fire. Black Pete Torrance was exactly what I'd expected, a big man gone soft around the middle, with cruel eyes and hands that had clearly never done an honest day's work. But it was the casual way he was sharpening a knife while discussing what he'd do to the children that made me want to put a bullet in him right then and there. Around him, his men lounged against the rock walls, some playing cards, others cleaning weapons, all of them displaying the kind of lazy confidence that comes from having never faced real opposition. They had no idea that death was crawling through the tunnels toward them, carried on the righteous anger of 2 fathers who had nothing left to lose. The explosion of violence began without warning, Cartwright's guns roaring from the far tunnel as he fought his way toward his children through a hail of return fire. I used the confusion to my advantage, the sawed-off shotgun speaking twice in quick succession, and turning 2 of Black Pete's men into memories before they even knew they were under attack. The chamber filled with smoke and screaming, the sound of ricocheting bullets and dying men creating a hellish symphony that echoed off the stone walls. Through it all, I could hear Cartwright shouting his children's names, his voice raw with desperation and fury, while Black Pete roared orders that nobody could hear above the chaos of battle. "You're too late, Sheriff," Black Pete bellowed as he grabbed a young girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, pressing his knife to her throat while his remaining men formed a protective circle around him. The child's eyes were wide with terror, but I could see Cartwright's stubborn determination in her face, the same refusal to surrender that had made her father the most wanted man in 3 territories. The standoff stretched between us like a taut wire, everyone frozen in a tableau of violence and desperation, while the dust slowly settled around our feet. I had a clear shot at Torrance, but not one that wouldn't risk the child's life, and I could see the same terrible calculation playing out in Cartwright's eyes as he weighed his daughter's immediate safety against the certainty that Black Pete would kill her anyway. "Let her go," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest, "and I'll let you walk out of here." It was a lie, and everyone in the chamber knew it, but sometimes lies served a purpose that truth could not. Black Pete laughed, a sound like grinding glass, and pressed the knife closer to the girl's throat, drawing a thin line of blood that made her whimper in fear. "You think I'm stupid, Morrison. You think I don't know what happens to me the minute I let go of this brat." His confidence was cracking, though. I could see it in his eyes. He'd expected to be facing one broken outlaw begging for his children's lives, not two armed men who'd already proven they could kill his people. The moment came, as these moments always do. Suddenly and without warning, the girl bit down hard on Black Pete's hand, her small teeth drawing blood and surprising him into loosening his grip just enough for her to twist away. 3 guns fired simultaneously, mine, Cartwright's, and Black Pete's, the sounds merging into a single thunderclap that seemed to shake the entire mine. When the smoke cleared, Black Pete Torrance lay sprawled on the rocky floor, his cruel eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling while his blood slowly spread beneath him like spilled wine. The girl ran to her father, who caught her with one arm while keeping his smoking pistol trained on the few remaining bandits, his face a mixture of relief and protective fury. The surviving members of Black Pete's gang threw down their weapons, their leader's death breaking whatever hold he'd had over them, revealing them to be the cowards they'd always been beneath their pretense of strength. As I secured the prisoners with rope from their own supplies, I watched Cartwright reunite with his son, the boy throwing himself into his father's arms with a sob that spoke of terror endured and hope maintained through the darkest hours. The morning sun was streaming down through the mine's main entrance now, turning the dust motes into dancing specks of gold and washing away the shadows that had hidden so much evil. It was over, but I knew that the choices made in this place would echo through all our lives forever. As we emerged from the mine into the clean morning air, I realized that everything I thought I knew about justice and mercy had been turned upside down in the space of a single night. Samuel Cartwright was still a wanted man, still responsible for the crimes that had made him an outlaw, but he was also a father who had sacrificed everything to save his children from a fate worse than death. The law demanded that I arrest him, but something deeper than law, something that spoke to the very core of what it meant to be human, demanded something else entirely. I looked at Martha, waiting by our horses with tears of relief streaming down her face, then at the children clinging to their father as if they'd never let him go again, and I made the only choice my conscience would allow. "Samuel Cartwright died in that mine," I said quietly, watching understanding dawn in his eyes. "These children need their father, and sometimes mercy is the highest form of justice a man can dispense."